So you asked me what it's like in the Phoenix Islands.
Yeah.
I mean, I say to you, what depth, my friend? Because
yeah.
it's amazing at all levels, and it's at every level. It just takes my breath away to see so much nature. I mean, it's amazing.
Well, hello everyone. Today my guest is Dr. Randi Rotjan. You know, you and I work together at the New England Aquarium. Now you've moved on and I've also moved on. And I know you've got a stellar academic background with, you know, all the accolades, all the degrees, all the PhDs and the DDDs and the alphabet soup, yeah, all that stuff behind your name, and you've been associated with Harvard and Boston, and you're now a professor at Boston University, and all these wonderful things. But you know what I saw in you when I first met you was a fire in your eye, you know, and a passion for nature and science. That's what I loved about you too. Science was like your thing, right? And I mean, I like science too. I'm a scientist and everything, but I have to say I'm not as an adherent follower as you of it as the guiding light. I'd like to start this off with a quote, actually, from someone who was important to me, Jacques Cousteau. He says, "What is a scientist after all?" It made me think of you. And he says, "It is a curious," he said man, but I'm going to insert woman. "It is a curious woman looking through the keyhole of nature, trying to know what is going on."
I love that. I'm going to have to write that down. I love that.
Yeah, and I like the keyhole because it really is, we're pretty restricted in our view, but we're looking into this other universe, right? And it's how good are you at looking through that keyhole, and you're really good at that. And
Thank you.
You adhere to this, you know, highest scientific standards, but you have the passion that drives you. You know, I know you, but our listeners all don't know you. So could you just tell me how you describe yourself for the world, your profession, where are you from, a little bit of personal background and all that.
Yeah, sure. And then I actually want to revisit your keyhole of science thing.
Right,
I have an idea on that too.
Okay.
But so for the record, I am a faculty member at Boston University, and I have a joint appointment with biology in the Boston University Marine Program. I'm from New York, but I'm from
New York.
But this is part of the key that's kind of interesting. I'm not from New York City, and I'm not from upstate. I'm from just about 20 minutes north of the GW Bridge and just about 20 minutes south of the Appalachian Trail. So I grew up in a place where you could be in literally one of the epicenters, right, of humanity, and then also be in the middle of the woods. And I really...
Like E.O. Wilson was the same. He was a New Yorker who found his nature nearby too, but go on, yeah.
Yeah, and so I don't know, city mouse, country mouse, I fit both places, and it's been really a formative part of who I am, is to be able to work in both worlds. And
what was it about the ocean? I mean, you know, you and I are like ocean people, right? And it was usually like a first experience or something that drew you into the ocean. I mean, you're not a bank manager. You know, you're not a taxi driver. There's nothing wrong with those professions. They're wonderful. But you were driven by passion for a subject area, and it's the ocean. What was your first memory, or what drew you there?
Oh, you know, I don't know. My parents were great. They took us all over the place, and you know, oceans, forests, mountains, desert, all of it. And I knew I loved nature, like you said, but I didn't know which ecosystems I really wanted to play in. I really loved them all. But I really, really sort of found the ocean as a potential vocation when I went out to Shoals Marine Lab for the first time, which was a pretty cool place to work.
I know Shoals.
Yeah, have you been out there?
Yeah, I have. Yeah, it's a wonderful ocean habitat. There's that island that comes out of the deep ocean, and there's a lot of shoals around it, a lot of whales and herring and stuff. Yeah, keep going. Yeah.
Yeah, and so there's a really neat marine lab out there that's co-owned by UNH and Cornell, and they take students out, undergraduate students out, and it's just a really special place to discover the ocean because you're out there immersed in it and in nature all the time. I mean, you're basically living in a seagull colony, and you know, at the mercy of the wind and the weather and the tides, and you just sort of find your way, and it's all right there, so you can explore everything. And it's a perfect entree for it was for me.
What else was there that got you into the ocean? Give me the real story.
All right, the real story goes like this. I loved biology, but didn't know what I wanted to work on. And actually, I originally started off college thinking I would be a communications or an English major, and shifted to science I took a serious pivot when I started taking general studies courses. But I went all the way through college. I went to Cornell, and I still didn't know what I wanted to study. And so I took 2 years off and worked as a technician in a plant genetics department, working with Arabidopsis, which is kind of a model organism. And I went to the library, that old-fashioned thing, that library.
Yeah.
You actually had
I love libraries.
Paper and journals, and I would just read a lot because I knew I wanted to go to graduate school, and I knew I loved biology, and I knew I was destined for a career in research, but I didn't know, I couldn't focus. And I just read and kept a little notebook. I still do this. I'm a really hardcore notebook kind of kid, and I just kept track of what I was reading, and just would flip through stuff, and if I read more than the title, I would write it down and who wrote it. And if I read the whole paper, I would take some notes on it. And after a couple of months of just reading whenever I had a few extra minutes, I kind of flipped through the notebook and watched and kind of looked at my own pattern and realized that it was all ocean stuff, with very little exception. And I just wrote to the people whose papers I'd read the most of and said, I'd like to be your graduate student, and I applied there, and that's how I did it.
And who was the person that?
I went with Sarah Lewis, who is perfect for me, and we're still so close. She's at Tufts, and she's really famous now for her work in fireflies. She studies sexual selection in insects, and she worked on fireflies and flower beetles, but she got her start out in Kiribati in Belize looking at ocean herbivory. And so she, like me, had general interests and was broadly trained and had some insect background. And I was so lucky to have her as a mentor. I was a happy graduate student, and she was able to sort of really think about ideas and hypotheses and theory, and then bring in the system as part of it. And she's a good natural historian, and so I ended up with the ocean by looking at my own patterns, and I found the perfect mentor.
And then people. Yeah, it's always about
person.
people in the end. People that steer you, mentors, you know.
Yeah.
I had very, very lucky to have 3 or 4 great mentors in my career.
Mentors are so important.
Yeah.
And she, it's interesting, I haven't thought about it until right this minute, but the book that she's writing and the TED Talk that she recently gave are all about wonder. And so I think that she has also helped instill a little bit of this spark of keeping the creative and keeping sort of the wonder alive. And that's certainly a part of all that we've been talking about today. And we just haven't put a name on it, but there it is. And I did my undergraduate thesis on honeybees. Did you know that?
No, I didn't.
I still keep bees today.
That's good. I like that.
Cool. I love bees. Well, they're colonial organisms. Just
well,
like
no, I don't
girls.
like the bees. I mean, I like bees. Don't get me wrong, but I like the lateral nature of your background. I like people that have a variety of things, because when you bring a rich, diverse background to your profession, I feel like you're actually a more effective scientist. I mean, I remember when I was in graduate school, I was trying to decide whether to do calculus-based statistics or algebra-based statistics, or which one to do. And my professor sat me down. He said, Stone. He said, what do you know about Brahms?
What?
And I said, Brahms? Well, not much. And he said, forget about that stuff. Study Brahms. And it was a message to me about, being a breadth of knowledge in your background, whether it's cultural or not. But so you started out with honeybees.
I did.
Wow. Okay.
Social insects are amazing, and they're really fascinating. A fascinating system. I love honey. Who doesn't?
Yeah.
And I had the right mentor. So I worked with Tom Seeley and Nick Calderon, who were both giants of their field, and it was just a great opportunity to kind of get in and sort of really think about and be trained classically into how to think about science, how to think about questions, how to approach behavior, how to link behavior with ecology.
Kind of explains you a little bit now. Okay.
Yeah, and so it's just a good way to sort of think about being a scientist. And this is advice that I give to students all the time now. When people want to get into ocean science.
Yeah, I get that question a lot too.
All the time,
what do you say? What do you say?
I always say sort of, you can get to the ocean in a million different ways, but science is a process that's pretty well scripted at this point, and so just be a great scientist, and you can study anything from slime molds to trees to honeybees, but just be learn how to really think and really put a good experiment together. And thinking about that keyhole of science, I always think about science as having a conversation with nature, and she doesn't like to reveal her secrets, so you have to figure out how to be a good scientist. You have to ask the question in exactly the right way so that she's willing to give you an answer, and then of course you have another question, and that's the whole thing, is you're going back and forth and back and forth. And so as soon as you train to be a good scientist, then you can move to any system and do well, I think.
Yeah, I get another quote I love. It's from a 19th century poet, but it was applied to the deep sea, and he called it a world of wonder where creation seems no more the work of nature but her dreams.
You're full of great quotes today. I love
anyway,
this.
I had to stay with that one for a second, but when people come to me, and I get a lot of young people coming saying, hey, you do ocean exploration science, I want to do what you do. And they ask me what it is they need to do. I have kind of a trick question I ask them. I always say, oh, okay, that's great. I said, have you thought about doing anything else?
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
And if they say, yeah, I've thought about being a doctor or an architect or whatever, I always say, do that. It's a lot easier. But if they say, no, I've only thought about the ocean, I've only thought about the kind of things that you do, it's been my sole focus, I say, you're going to be just fine. Because that's what it takes. It takes the kind of passion that you have, the kind of round-the-clock attention. You never let it go. Whether you're diving
obsessive.
or whether you're whether you're obsessive on the other end of a teleconference line, studying the deep sea, or whether you're teaching or whatever it is. It really takes that all in, and it's happiness too. I would say happiness is a very good compass. If you find your happiness, that is really, you will find success. What brought us together, Randy, and one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show today is, what was it, about 10 years ago, Was that when it was when we first?
We met in 2008. Yeah,
2000,
exactly.
about
Happy 10-year anniversary.
10
Greg.
years ago. 10 years ago, I had about 6 or 7 years into this project in the South Pacific called the Phoenix Islands Protected Area.
Yeah.
Very close to my heart, and I saw your energy. I saw the light inside you, and I wanted you involved in this project. And I went to you and I explained it. You were so busy with other things. You kind of said, well, maybe, I don't know. You said, and I think,
true.
and I'd like to know. It was kind of interesting because you have just like you're showing such spectacular leadership and such spectacular science in the Phoenix Islands Protected Area, which is located in the Central Pacific Ocean, and it's been described as the most important act in the history of marine conservation. And I'd like to ask you, why is that?
I could give you lots of answers, but the best answer is sitting right in front of me, Greg. I mean, it's you. You definitely created a really incredible conservation context for this place, and that's a story that we should definitely tell. But I think the reason it's going to go down in the history books is because it was one of the first. It was the first of its kind. So prior to the inception of PIPA, right?
Right.
There was the Great Barrier Reef in the late 70s, which was sort of the first large marine protected area, but the Great Barrier Reef and the GBR, I mean, it's awesome, but it wasn't fully closed, and it was coastal.
You know, when it was first created, it was not nothing was closed.
I mean, that's
Did
the
you know
thing,
that?
right? Marine protected areas they have all kinds
and
of different shades of gray.
Today, only 33% of it is close to human activity. The other 70-odd percent is open to various forms. But yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Again, it's coastal off the continent of Australia, and it's owned by a developed country.
Well-resourced country.
Well-resourced country, exactly. And so the Phoenix Islands Protected Area was grand in many scales, right? Grand in size, grand in vision, grand in strategy, and grand because it was put together by a much less well-resourced country who wanted to give what they call it, their gift to humanity, which is really just an incredible turn of phrase for the Republic of Kiribati, who owns and operates this marine protected area, to have put forth such an incredible gesture and a gift to themselves as well, right? Where they can actually protect their own marine resources and really sort of catalyze marine conservation in the ocean. That was the vision, as you well know. And I think the thing that will make it go down in history is that it didn't just remain a vision, that actually happened.
Right.
So, that marine protected area came online, and then within seconds it was Papahanaumokuakea, right, where they were neck and neck with the U.S. government under President Bush's leadership. And then afterwards, it was just a cascade of large marine protected areas.
It began that movement
of,
you look around the world today and there's quite a few marine protected areas of scale, and it seems normal now. But back then it was not normal.
It was completely revolutionary.
It was a brand new idea, and it was such a new idea that there were actually a lot of critics of it at the time, actually.
Yeah, I remember
that didn't think it could be pulled off and this and that, and they were proved wrong in the end. But it was Daniel Pauly that said it was the most important act in the history of marine conservation. And I asked him about that once. I said, Daniel, why did you say that? Because I was really curious. And he said, well, Greg, it's a couple things. He said it's because it was a very heavily fished area. It's where most of the tuna in the world comes from, that central part of the Pacific Ocean. So you were actually giving a place in the ocean that's highly productive a rest. And that had never been done before.
I know, that's amazing.
It had never been done before. And then he pointed something out to me which I hadn't thought about. And he said, and Greg, think of all the bycatch that's not being taken in there.
Oh yeah.
And that really got me. I said, you're right. I said, thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of birds and turtles and dolphins and other kinds of fish and marine species that get caught inadvertently in a fishing operation. And suddenly in this big area, they weren't. And then I started thinking about it, and I kind of closed my eyes, and I realized this is an area the size of California.
Yeah, it's
huge. It's deep, and had been loaded with fishing boats for decades. Engines, noise engines, making noise in the water, lots of nets in the water, fish, everything being taken out. And then suddenly, quiet.
It's not just bycatch, right? It's the side effects of all that action and all that.
Yeah.
Nobody ever talks about ocean side effects, or at least I don't hear that all the time. But it's true. It's a
sound's becoming more of an issue.
I know, but there's no phrase for that. You should
sound pollution. Well, sound pollution.
Yeah, but it's not just sound, right? It's also, of course it's sound, but it's also the risk of something falling overboard, or extra debris, or extra pollutants, or other things like that. And it's also just all the things that come with high traffic, right? And
yeah, you're right. Well, I think it's part of our journey in occupying the planet Earth and occupying at the level we have finally. You realize it's only been in the last century that we've occupied every continent on the Earth, right? Antarctica was the last one that we started to occupy 24 hours a day, 12 months a year, and that didn't happen really until the 1950s. So we went from a small tribe of a couple of thousand people in Africa
of course.
to 7 to soon to be 9 or 10 billion. And now we occupy the whole planet, and it's our impact now on this very small planet with so many of us we need to pay attention to that. And this concept of giving parts of the Earth a rest has only evolved in the ocean recently, and the Phoenix Islands was one of the first, and I think remains one of the most important because of the high value of it there. Now, what you brought to the Phoenix Islands is your research. I love the expression, definition of science is it's just a system of rules that keeps us from lying to each other.
Another great one. Oh my God. Good.
It's very helpful. And because, everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but not their own facts. And when we're talking about policy scale decisions that humanity makes in the way we behave, the way we occupy the planet, as I said earlier, and the way we take fish out of the ocean, the way we do things, that policy, the rules need to be informed by facts, not by opinions. Fishing industry, tourism industry, recreational dive industry, you name it, all these factors want to use the ocean and want to benefit from it, want to profit from it, and I support all of them. But they need to do it in ways that are bound by an understanding of how the system works in research. And that's what you do, that's what you're so good at. That's the strength that you brought to PIPA, the Phoenix Islands Protected Area. How are the results of your research used? And how do you want them to be used?
Well, I guess first let me back up for a second and say that for as much as I've tried to bring research and science to the Phoenix Islands, they've brought just as much to me. Throughout the 10 years we've worked on this project, the role of science has evolved too, and I'm now the co-chief scientist of the Phoenix Islands Protected Area. And Trust, yep, and with Torika Tamari, who's the director
Full
of fisheries.
disclosure, I'm the chairman of that trust.
Yes,
so.
it's true.
Yeah.
Do we know each other? Have we met?
Yeah.
And part of the science that's happened there, and part of my science that's happened there, has been informed by management needs, right? Where people have said, we need to know more about this, or what do we know about this? And so it's stretched me too. And so I think that has also been a real two-way give and take and conversation that has been really gratifying. I am grateful every minute for my background in honeybees, and I used to work with plants and a bunch of different systems because, again, it's that breadth of thinking that has been able to just help.
I call lateral thinking.
Yeah, sure.
Is the way I call it.
Exactly.
Yeah,
so that's been really helpful to be sort of a bit more of a marine biology generalist. But what gets me out of bed in the morning with this project is the fact that I have 2 little children, and I think about nature all the time. You're right. I am singularly obsessed, and nature is so bounded in a lot of the world, right? You can look at a forest on you can take a satellite or look at Google Earth and you can see pretty clearly exactly where the boundaries of this forest are. And you can see exactly where the boundaries of this patch of desert or wildflower meadow
it's
or
bounded.
whatever.
What do you mean by that? It's bounded by us?
It's bounded
by people
by us.
or by
It
nature?
has a
or both?
road. It
Yeah,
has
okay.
it can't, there's people everywhere, like you say.
Right.
And nature can kind of do its thing within those bounds sometimes, depending on the scale of nature you're talking about. But when you really think about what nature should be and you want to ask questions, I want to have a conversation with nature. I don't want to have a conversation with nature that's completely impacted by humans. And so you got to go where a place where you can actually have a real conversation, where you can have a moment, in a quiet conversation with wilderness. And the Phoenix Islands is, for me, that's part of why I work there. And why I've spent so much time and energy trying to make the science there spectacular, because there are good questions to be asked and you can have a chance of a real answer. I love that.
That idea of a conversation with nature, I love it, because I've often said that in the beginning, the Phoenix Islands taught me about what the ocean was like originally. The original state. That's the conversation we had. It said, Greg, this is what the ocean was a couple of thousand years ago. Yeah. And you've never seen it before, but here it is, because people don't live here now, and they actually have never lived there, really. It was a little too far to the
history is so interesting.
Yeah, even the amazing ancestors of the Micronesians and the Polynesians and the Melanesians on those canoe voyages that were the equivalent of the space shuttle flights of today, back then, they didn't spend a lot of time here. They were more attracted to, let's call it, the bright lights of Tahiti and Fiji and the higher islands where there were more people. So these islands have never had...
a little easier living, too. God, it's hard to live out there in that scrubby...
Well, in some ways it's hard. In other ways it's easier. The fishing is really good around these islands. True. And I know from talking to my Kiribati friends that their ancestors chose these islands because of the high production of the ocean.
For sure.
And they said that the islands were just a place to park their canoes at night. That they were out in the water during the day as real ocean people. And we'll talk about that more on another episode, maybe today. But then the Phoenix Islands started to talk to me about fishing, because there was so much tuna fishing going on there, and there was gillnet fishing, and I got involved with helping to alleviate some of that pressure, and that's where the protection idea came out, and what was the impact of that. And then it started to talk to me about climate change. We started to see the effects of climate change out in an area that is about as far from the centers that create climate change as you can get. You know, the industrial centers of Europe and North America and Asia that, you know, push the greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. The Phoenix Islands is about as far away from those centers of greenhouse gas production as you can get. So that was my conversation with the Phoenix Islands. It was like primal ocean, fishing, and climate. And I think it's really today about the human dimension. I'd like you to describe, if you would please, in your own words, what it's like at the Phoenix Islands, like above water and below water.
You know, if you're going and you're approaching it on a ship and you just sort of see these little specks appear before you, they look small. Really nothing.
Very diminutive islands.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they're low profile, and the maximum elevation is probably 1 to 2 meters tops. Some of them have no trees on them. You'll see a cloud of seabirds above them.
They're just tops of ocean mountains, really.
Really, that's what they are, and that's exactly it. And then you jump in the water, and if you're snorkeling, right, and you're staying in the super shallows, you'll see, like our good friend Rob likes to say, squillions of fish, right? And so you get to see squillions of fish around you, and you'll see a reef that's complicated. You know, you'll see a wave-pounded reef that is as it should be. So you'll see spaces where there's spurs and grooves, and some of them are tucked in with tons of corals, and other spaces are so wave-pounded that they're kind of scrubby. But it gives you a sense, it calibrates my understanding of what a pretty natural reef can look like.
Complicated reef. You mean it's got diversity? It's got different kinds of things going on,
yeah, exactly.
which you don't have in other areas because it's been impacted.
Yeah, it's different, right? So you get to see the reef in it's a complicated ecosystem. You get to appreciate its complexity, its natural complexity. And then as you go deeper, if you're on scuba, you know, it's really neat because then you start to be in that three-dimensional space where you can start to see a reef come alive with all of its trophic layers. And what I mean by that is you get to see the large predators. I mean, there's a lot of reef sharks there, and they're not aggressive, and you can watch them sort of prowl the top of the reef, but with all the other so many fish just rise into the water column. It'll come down when a shark passes by and then rise back up, and you can start to see the rhythm of the reef, which I really love, to sort of just watch everybody move and see the whole system work together. And it's loud. If you're quiet for a minute, you could hear all the fish start to eat and munch and move and swish, and I love that. And then as you go deeper, and now you need tech to do it, you can't go down yourself. You know, we've discovered what lives on some of these seamounts.
How deep?
The deepest we have explored in the Phoenix Islands protected area is just under 6,000 meters, which is amazing.
So that's like 18,000 feet.
Sure.
Yeah,
yes.
okay.
Roughly.
Or 3.5 miles.
Down.
Exactly.
Straight
down. Okay.
Yeah, and there's stuff
That's
there
deep.
too.
That's
Yeah,
deep.
and so as you go all the way down, you pass through all these ocean layers. And at the deepest spot, you know, there was, which is in a sort of a hadal trough in the center of this protected area. There's these half-meter large sea cucumbers, and there's monoplacophorans, which are really cool, sort of old and ancient species, and there's all kinds of stuff. Oof, don't make me estimate that, Greg. I don't know.
Well, but thousands of years old, right?
Yeah, dinosaur age, if not pre.
But there's coral down there.
There's coral down there too, and it's unbelievable.
Yeah,
and as you know, one of the things that we just did actually on our most recent trip down doing a deep sea expedition is we kind of started to put these pieces together. You know, when you look at the top, like I said, they are diminutive, or as you said. And Charles Darwin was actually the first one to really describe the process of oceanic atolls, and he visited the Phoenix Islands.
He went to the Phoenix Islands in the Beagle, didn't he?
He totally
Isn't
did.
that incredible?
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
And he described, how the process happens. It's these volcanic islands, these volcanoes, which then recede, and you get this central shallow lagoon as the ocean recedes, and you get the ring around it because you have a living coral.
Melville went there too,
Yeah. I mean,
Melville based part of his Moby Dick story on the Phoenix Islands. Yeah.
I mean, there's such a long history, right, of incredible people who've been there who've described this. But the thing about Darwin, and so this is the key piece, this is back to Darwin, is that he predicted that if this were true, then you'd have this calcium carbonate cap on the top of a basaltic volcanic island, and that carbonate cap would be entirely based on the minerals deposited by calcareous organisms that are living there, namely corals, but other things. And we did this. We started, I don't remember exactly what depth we started at, but around 2,500 meters deep. and went all the way up, and we watched the transition from volcano to
you saw the
calcium
volcanic
carbonate
rock, and you found the cap.
We did, and we found the switch, and we went all the way up, and then we actually took the ROV. And we
What depth was the transition?
It's a couple hundred meters
Yeah,
down.
that's what I thought. Yeah,
maybe a little, just under 1,000 meters, and then we went all the way up to 100 meters, and that's the limit of what you can do in that tech. But you can watch the sun. You can sort of, it looks like the sunrise because you're cutting into the photic zone, and we just watch that whole transition, and so you asked me what it's like in the Phoenix Islands.
Yeah.
I mean, I say to you, what depth, my friend, because it's amazing at all levels, and and at every level, it just takes my breath away to see so much nature and no signs of humanity. Really, no trash, no debris, it's amazing.
Yeah. So my first dives there, I remember what struck me is I was down at about 50 feet on scuba, and suddenly it got dark, and in my experience, when it got dark, I thought a storm had come over. It was starting to rain above or something like that. But I looked up and it wasn't a storm, it was a school of fish. And I'd never seen a school of fish that were that dense.
That's how they used to describe passenger pigeons, right? They
Yeah.
were so dark they used to,
Exactly.
cloud
And
the
then you
sky.
mentioned the sharks. First dive there, I remember I counted 100 to 150 gray reef sharks and white tip sharks and black tip sharks. And I must admit, at that point in my diving career, I'm much more experienced now. I was pretty, kept my wits about me.
As you should.
Kept my eye on all these guys. But by the end of the first couple of weeks, we were so used to them. They were like just all around us all the time. And we'd go down at night. I remember thinking back now, with your flashlight doing something, I'd be this whoosh by my head, and it'd be a big gray reef shark.
Wait. Can we back up?
Yeah.
You dove the Phoenix Islands at night?
All the time.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, whoa. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
You guys didn't do that?
No.
Oh.
Because
it safety?
we logged 4 or 5
Was it
dives,
safety?
during the day,
Safety?
and
Oh,
then
no,
we transit at night.
Oh, we tried it.
Yeah.
We did night dives every time we could.
Oh,
and
wow,
and
cool.
we made a
All right.
transition to doing them out in the outer ocean, open ocean too, because we started off just doing them in lagoons. And
Yeah,
I remember
I think we only did one at night.
I remember this particular dive I'm recalling now was on Canton, just as you come out of the lagoon and you turn right.
Yeah.
We were down there
Right.
and we were filming in nice dives. We were filming octopus and all kinds
That's
of
a
things.
perfect spot to go. That
And I
makes
remember
perfect
that
sense.
we were so used to the sharks, I couldn't see them, but I could feel them as they whooshed by me in the middle of the night. And I was thinking, la-di-da-di-da, it didn't matter. It was just, we had grown confident about them. Now, you shouldn't grow too confident because they are wild animals, and at some point you could get into a situation where they would get a little more aggressive. And we had one of those situations at Rawaki, the Phoenix Island itself.
Yeah.
There's one island called the Phoenix Island. And Rob Burrell and I were out there, and we got out of the water, and we both said that was one of the scariest dives we'd ever been on. When a shark gets aggressive, it assumes a body posture where its pectoral fins go down a little bit and its back hunches.
Yeah, I
And
see
all
it.
these sharks were doing that, and they were coming over at us and threatening us and trying to make us leave. They were clearly showing a territorial thing, like, this is my place, leave. And I think what it was is it was a bird island, and there was hundreds of thousands of birds on this island, and I think they were feeding on the birds, the little baby, the younger birds,
interesting.
because it's like in Midway Island, you get
Yeah.
tiger sharks come in for the albatross breeding,
Sure.
because the young albatross every 1 out of 50, 100, who knows what the number is, albatross that takes its first flight doesn't make it. It goes down to the water and the sharks eat it. I think that's what was going on in that island, and that's why they were so territorial. It was like the prime feeding spot.
My bird, not yours.
They're my birds, not yours. Get out of here.
Right.
We've heated our planet up, and the heat is translated from the atmosphere into the ocean, and ocean temperatures are rising. And corals have a particularly challenging time with this. Coral reefs. And I wondered if you could explain that to people. You're a teacher, you probably do it better than me. It's called coral bleaching, but what happens in that process, and what's the significance of the Phoenix Islands in this regard?
So corals are animals. Let's start there. And a good friend of mine likes to call them sea monsters, where he says they're animal, vegetable, and mineral all wrapped into one,
Yeah.
right? So the animal part is the living polyp, and their series of polyps, and then they have the vegetable part is in symbiosis with a dinoflagellate that photosynthesizes, just like plants. So it's using sunlight.
That's the zooxanthellae is a dinoflagellate.
Yeah, and now there was actually just a recent paper. They're being better.
It's like the coral's garden. They have their own little garden. Like they're farmers, right?
Yeah, sure. And so that's a good way to put it. And then of course the mineral part is the calcareous skeleton that they build, which is what builds reefs, right? So they're called coral reefs because these underwater cities are built by this animal-plant relationship. And what happens when corals bleach, simply put, is that the symbiotic relationship between the animal and the vegetable part breaks down, right? So the coral and its symbiont disassociate.
And they like suck the glucose out of the dinoflagellate
Yeah,
that
so
lives in them? Is that how it works?
there's a really interesting relationship, nutritional relationship, exactly right, where you have both partners in this mutualism get something out of it. And so you end up, you do have translocation of carbon across, and carbohydrates across symbiont to host, and then you have the host can provide a bit more of the nitrogen from the host back to the symbiont, and it goes back and forth and back and forth. And what happens when this breaks down is that corals have a hard time, A, getting enough carbon to build their calcium carbonate skeletons, and B, they're not getting enough sugar, and they have to start living on the reserves that they have. And corals.
But can't they also pull things out of the water? They have a carnivorous side too, right?
A little bit. Some more than others. So there's like 450 some odd coral species in the world in the shallow reefs, and they all have really different. There's really quite the spectrum. But let me back up and just say this for people who are unfamiliar with corals. I always like to start with plants because people kind of understand them. And corals are a lot like plants in some ways, right? They need the sunlight. They're sessile. They're modular. They hang out in one spot. But plants have roots, and in roots they can store carbon. They can store nutrients. They can store energy. And if a plant gets sheared at the surface, you've seen this a million times. It can regrow from its roots.
Right.
Corals don't have that. What you see is what you get. They have a little bit of tissue mass embedded within the calyx of the polyp inside their skeleton, but they don't have this deep root structure. And so when they bleach, when they lose this symbiosis, they have only a very little bit of energy reserve to draw from. And so when the host and the symbiont dissociate, it sets a clock.
It's starvation, right?
Starvation, exactly. And so the coral has a little bit of time, depending on whether or not it can feed a little bit heterotrophically and pull things out. It can maybe build in more of a buffer, or if it has a deep-bodied polyp, it can use a little bit more of a buffer. But if it's a shallow polyp depth and it can't feed very well, and there's lots of corals which are like this because what they need to feed is sunlight, and that's never in short supply. So it makes sense.
So some corals actually only rely 100% on the sugar that's created through photosynthesis.
100%, because 100% is like
mostly.
But mostly, yeah.
Okay, because I'd always gone with the 60-40% kind of rule.
But there's a spectrum. There's a lot of different corals out there, and some can do a pretty good job of switching and starting to feed more when they're stressed from bleaching.
Pulling organic out of with a little tentacle, right? It's like a little feeding tentacle.
But here's the other thing: the ocean isn't constant and doesn't provide a constant supply of food either. And so some places are naturally oligotrophic, which are nutrient poor, and many coral reefs, not all, but many of them actually are thriving in places where you don't have a whole lot of food in the water, because when a coral is not bleached, then there's nothing to cloud the sunlight coming down, and so they have better access to the sunlight, right? And so it's complicated, and it's not. The simple part of this is that when this relationship breaks down, corals have a very limited window of opportunity to regain their health, regain their symbionts, and keep growing. And if that window of time runs out, if that clock stops, there's mortality.
And it's the symbiont that doesn't like the heat, right? The corals.
It's both.
They're both, but
but
isn't the symbiont more the phytoplankton, the plant that lives in the coral? That's more sensitive, to my understanding. That it gets hot and it says, "I'm out of here," and it leaves. But the coral's alive for a while.
You have just hit one of the still really important and active areas of research in coral biology. So just to add I'm sorry, I'm going to be
I want to hear it.
Rigorous,
I want to hear it.
Exacting.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of complexity here. And so there's complexity in the coral species, and there's complexity in the symbiont species too. And there's a lot of different species and a lot of different strains. Cool. And who has control over this relationship, or who wears the pants, is not totally known.
Or maybe the coral says, "You get out of here now.
Yeah, I'm
done. It's too hot for both of us. I need some space."
Yeah, and maybe the symbiont says, "I'm leaving." And so the implication of host control or symbiont control is not fully known, and it's certainly not known on a species by species level.
So I didn't know that. That's
it's one of the things that we're still trying to dial in on, because you can imagine, right, a situation where a coral host really needs its symbiont, and the symbiont says, "I'll do better off free living. See you later." And you can imagine a time where the host says, "Whoa, I can barely support myself. I can't support you also.
Can't support you too, yeah.
Out you go." And so it's...
And maybe it's like a marriage that's really hot in the house and everybody's irritable. They just have to get away from each other for a while. No.
I don't know if I want to go to marriage. It's not quite a marriage, but yeah.
Okay, so the coral has a plant that lives in it, and it produces sugar from the miracle of photosynthesis.
It is amazing.
And then the coral, which is an animal, harvests that. It absorbs it through its tissue, its cell walls, right?
Exactly.
And then when it goes into this state of bleaching, they disassociate, and you
Right.
just said it's for various reasons, and it looks white.
It looks
And that's
white.
why it's
And
called
for
bleaching, right?
Yeah.
It's a misnomer. It's not really bleaching.
No,
It's
nobody
beca-
poured a
it's
bucket
be-
of bleach on top of it. It's what it called
and
when it looks white.
And it's because the plant is what gives coral
It's
its color, right?
Yeah.
And you have all these different colors of coral. That's all the different colors of the plant that lives in the coral. It's really kind of an interesting thing. So it turns white. That's the bleaching, but it's still alive for a while.
Yes.
And that varies, right?
Yes.
Depending on the situation.
Absolutely.
But you can get the plants can come back and repopulate the coral, right? And the color
Yeah.
comes back, or
You
the
can.
coral dies, right? Okay. Can you connect these reefs to New York, where you grew up, or to?
Absolutely.
All right. How do you do that? Why should people care? What's the purpose of even learning all this stuff about?
Have you
what's
seen
going-
Finding Nemo?
Yeah, I love Finding Nemo.
Yeah, all drains lead to the ocean, right? It's a little bit
Yeah.
different than that, but I'll start there and just
Okay,
say that first of
okay.
all, everybody lives in a watershed,
Yep.
and all watersheds drain to the ocean, and
Yeah.
so what we do, even in the in coastal areas, can influence almost the whole ocean, in some way, shape, or form. And if you don't influence it coastally, we influence it atmospherically, right?
Right.
And so we are moving things around this planet. Things are not static, right? Everything is dynamic, and
Right.
I think we would be fools to think that what we do in New York has no influence on like the rest of it, the Atlantic. Of course it does. And nature is a whole planetary system that functions. And so for me, coral bleaching is a symptom of what's happening globally. And the Phoenix Islands are part of this story, just to bring it home here,
Yep.
is because there are so few coral reefs where you can ask the million or probably billion or maybe even $1 trillion question of what do we do to buy reefs some time? And so if you were to ask this question in a coastal reef, you would have to ask this question amidst coastal runoff, amidst overfishing, amidst disease, amidst sewage, you name it, right? Like all the things. And you have to go to the places where there are no people, where it's relatively uninhabited, where it's pretty far away from coastal influences, and it only has global influence. And then you can ask the question, can we buffer against global influence? What is the true impact of ocean or global influence, and how do we calibrate this? And so that's what we can learn from a place like the Phoenix Islands. And I have to tell you, everyone always wants to know the answer after I say this, and
Yeah.
the answer is complex, and we're still working it out. I mean, what I can tell you is that in some places in the Phoenix Islands, there's been mortality and then recovery that's happened really, really fast. And in other places, recovery has been slower than I ever would have thought. And that natural complexity, right? That conversation with nature, we're not done having it. We're still
Yeah.
we're
No, that's
we're
good.
still engaged.
But I want to kind of come back to you again, Randy. You a real model. You're a real model in science and the world. And I saw a picture of you with your kids on your lap, and you were looking at a screen of the deep sea.
Yeah,
So you were in Boston, I guess, right?
I was in my home office.
You were in your home office, and what were you doing?
I was deep sea diving.
Yeah.
I had 5 screens set up in my home office, and the world is so digital now, and there's costs and benefits to that. But one of the biggest benefits in ocean exploration is that you don't need to be on the ship all the time, every time. I mean, in collaboration
Not like
with
the
others,
old days.
Well, look, I love being on the ship, and I definitely still go to the Phoenix Islands. I was just there last
Yeah.
year. But, after running 14 of these expeditions in collaboration with others, and I have 2 little children. I have an almost 4-year-old and an almost 7-year-old, and it's too much time to leave them for a month every single time. That would be way too much. So I was, that particular cruise was run by NOAA's Office of Ocean Exploration and Research, OER, and they had taken the Okeanos Explorer out to the Phoenix Islands, and I was on the phone with them constantly, and you set up a chat screen where you can talk to the other scientists and the ROV pilots right then and there. And then you set up a screen where you can see all the navigation functions. So you can see exactly what the pilots see and what everyone on ship sees. And then you see another screen that the science cam sees, and then another screen where you can see what
So you're actually sitting in your home, and you're connected live to a ship many thousands of miles away.
Yeah,
and not only that, but the ship has a vehicle, a robot,
Yeah.
at the end of a tether, maybe
Yeah.
3 miles under the water.
Telepresence. It's amazing.
incredible.
So you know what's even cooler about it?
Yeah.
So all the screens are coming in, and do you want to know what the delay is? Because you might say, but you're not seeing it in real time. There's a 5-second delay between this, what you see and where they are. And if that's too long, and sometimes it is when you're trying to make split-second decisions,
Yeah.
if you're really involved,
It's kind of long, yeah.
yeah, you can pick up the phone and then it's real time. And so, they have a direct line in. And so, and this isn't just for me. This is one of these things where the whole model of ocean exploration for NOAA in particular is really brilliant, because they will enlist the help of 20 to 30 scientists around the globe with various expertise. Because I can talk about corals competently and the Phoenix Islands competently, but if you asked me about I don't know, acorn worms, I'd be a little out of my depth. And so, you get different people's expertise, and
much more efficient.
and they come together, and everyone's on the chat room together, and everybody's watching, and they touch in for different parts, and you can kind of phone a friend when you're in trouble and just say, I don't know what this is, but there's an echinoderm expert at the Smithsonian, let me call him.
Because I remember when we first started working together on this, and you were setting up some expeditions. This one I was much more directly involved. We've evolved in different ways now, but I remember there was one expedition, and like it was going along, planning, it was all happening, and then one day you said to me that you weren't actually going on the trip. And I was like, what? You said, don't worry, I don't have to go because I da-da-da-da-da, and you gave me confidence. And the reason I even asked that is I come from the old school, right?
Yeah.
When I started going to sea, we would go out for months at a time.
Yeah.
And we didn't have internet. We had.
It's my favorite way to travel, don't get me wrong.
We really didn't have communication.
Yeah.
There were shortwave radios on the boat that they would use for emergencies and for business traffic, but we would go for months without having any contact with the land and just doing our science and our research. And we'd usually write our papers on the way back in.
Yeah, totally.
We'd type our papers
Yep.
on the way back in, and then we'd submit the papers for publication, meet with some students, and then a month later you'd head out again. And it's all changed.
So let me be really clear on this, because I think this is a really important point. So first of all, I have 2 children, and like I just said, that's part of it. But I also really, really think that the sweet spot is somewhere in the middle. I've been on these expeditions. I've been to the Phoenix Islands, and without the context of being there and seeing it with my own eyes and swimming in the water and getting a sense for, this is over here, and when you round this corner, you see this, because you need to see it to sort of integrate and spatially sort of calibrate where you are. That has been. I can't imagine having worked in a place I've never been, right? You need that sort of gestalt.
Gestalt.
Right? The context for it. But once you have it, and you can't never go again, right? You need to kind of touch in on that and recalibrate your understanding every so often. But I'm also, I had babies while I've been working on this project. I was pregnant, I had newborns, and I wasn't gonna stop working in this place that I love so much just because I was pregnant. And so having these other options.
I admired you for how you handled that.
Oh God, it was complicated, but I remember sitting in.
You pulled it off.
My kids were born early. I remember being in labor and being like, "Okay, ship, I'm going to talk to you in a few hours. I have to have a baby now."
Yeah.
But
have the baby now.
Right. But really, but it's. I think that the sweet spot has to be in the middle. I think you can't doing just telepresence if you're doing it, and you're really running a project. You can't just do it remotely, and you can't always be there either. And so for me, at least in this particular project, in this context, it's been somewhere in the middle. And my favorite way to travel is the way that you have, right, is to go there and turn off everything else and just immerse yourself, right? I'm spending all this time and money to have a conversation with nature. I want to have it. I don't want to talk to everybody else at home, but I also wanted to have babies, and I'm really grateful that the world has changed enough to allow both.
What is your favorite ocean animal?
That changes by the second.
That's okay. Well, one of them. I know. Me too. I've got several, but just one of them.
Let's see. What shall I pick today? I am gonna go with Iridogorgia corals. I have to pick
esoteric. Yeah.
They are. I'm gonna pick something esoteric and a little weird.
That's all right.
These are super cool. They look like a curlicue.
Oh.
And they are.
Did we see them on the
deep sea coral. Yeah. It's a deep sea coral, and it just whirls around, and it just looks like something that Dr. Seuss would have created, right? It just doesn't look real, and yet it is, and it's full of thousands of mouths, and they've been alive. They can live for thousands of years, and I don't know, the fact that this exists, this improbable, beautiful,
I like that.
Completely Seussian thing exists, and it exists in the place where we work. And actually, it's a global genus. It's around everywhere. Family, at least, it's around everywhere. I don't know. I'm going to call it today. It's my favorite today.
Okay, got it.
I love it. What's yours?
Got it. Mine is starfish, echinoderms in general.
Really?
Yeah.
Why?
Because they're so ancient, and they are linked to the invertebrate world. It's where we think for the vertebrates struck out from, with the urochordates and all those guys.
Sure.
It's sort of an evolutionary reason for it, and I just like them. They're just kind of cool.
They're beautiful.
Yeah. For in all their glorious forms and whatnot.
And tamarack.
What about the most interesting dive you've done, or one of the most interesting dives? Doesn't have to be in the Phoenix Islands. It could be anywhere. But
what do you want? Do you want like the action, or do you
want
the?
Whichever way. You can go action, or you can go animals. You can go either way. Whatever.
I'm gonna go animals.
All right.
So I jumped in the water, and for the first time, and Raja Ampat's spectacular because it's one of the centers of biodiversity of our planet, if not like the center of marine biodiversity in our planet for shallow reefs. And I'm a pretty good coral biologist, and I really didn't know everything. I had to go back to the books and study. So I was a kid in the candy store, totally excited about it. And I head's deep in the corals, and I'm counting everything and trying to ID everything and, you know, taking careful measurements. And I come back up, and everyone's like, "Did you see the whale?" No, not even once. And I was like, I was trying to think back. I don't even remember something feeling like a cloud overhead, right? I totally missed the whale. All right, so then
It's in Rajan Pod.
it was in Rajan Pod. Huh. And then and then the next
think I've
day
ever
somebody's
seen a
like,
whale
"Did you see the wobbegong shark?" I'm like, "Yeah, I think I saw that one. It was right near a coral." And then it's like, "And did you see the pod of dolphins?" I was like, "No." And that was the day that I decided to start wearing a GoPro on my back. When I was
You wear a
diving.
GoPro? Is that right? So it looks backwards?
So, so that I can go back later and see what I missed. And so,
What a brilliant idea.
thank you.
I should start to do that.
Because my head's always in the coral. And so
Yeah.
it's not an interesting dive because there was anything spectacular that I saw. It was spectacular for what I didn't see. And it's just a reminder to myself to like keep looking around. And that every time you think you've seen everything on a dive, there's all this stuff you didn't see. I don't know.
That's a good one.
Yeah, I need a 360 view and I don't have it. So
Is there anything left that you'd like to say? I mean, you could say something to the listeners about what they can do, where they can go or not, or anything that's come to your mind where you just didn't get a chance to say it, you'd like to.
Thank you. Yeah. That's a nice opportunity. Yeah, there's two things actually. One is I'd really like to, for all of the fun and the hard work and commitment that you and I and many others have put towards the Phoenix Islands, I really just want to take 1 minute to really put the credit where credit's due and to say that, and I think we've mentioned this before, but really drive it home that the Republic of Kiribati deserves this incredible credit for thinking about this, for allowing an international group of scientists to work in partnership with them, because it's, the phrase, a rising tide floats all boats. This really has worked together in a genuine two-way partnership where we've worked together, and I am grateful for the opportunity to work in this place.
Most people haven't heard of this country. Most people haven't heard of this country either, but it's an extraordinary country.
It's unbelievable. And to work in a place where I feel like the international scientists bring something to the table, and the country brings something to the table, and together we make each other stronger. And it's been the honor of my life to work with these amazing people and in this incredible place, and I just want to make sure that they're...
I'm glad you did.
Yeah,
and let's point out what this is. We call it Kiribati, but it's spelled Kiribati.
Yeah, Kiribati.
Kiribati. It looks like Kiribati, but it's pronounced Kiribati. It's an island nation in the Central Pacific.
Yeah.
It has an enormous ocean area. It controls an area that's 3 million square kilometers. It's like 2/3 the size of the continental United States. They're an ocean state. They have 33 islands. Mostly ocean, though, is their territory, and they've been there for many thousands of years, and are amazing ocean people, and they've brought the Phoenix Islands as a gift to the world. So, thank you for that. Yeah. You said there were two things. Or?
Yeah. So that's the first, and the second thing is I just want to say that it's a funny thing to talk to an old friend, and do it in a podcast format. But I hope that science stays like this, stays fun, and just and real, and isn't afraid to engage in some of the passion of the issues. And I just think it's, there might be some future scientists out there listening these days, and the world has changed from sort of always being, just not engaging with the public, and now there's a lot of public engagement, and I really like that piece too. And so I wanted to say just thank you for the invitation, old friend.
Sure,
and
old
it's nice
friend,
to do this.
Well, Randi, thank you so much. I mean, it's a great pleasure to see you today, as always, but thank you for enlightening me and enlightening our audience. And as we go through our scuba tank of life, I'm a little further into my tank than you are, and we've taken the boat out today, and we come back to shore and thrown the lines on, and I look forward to our next voyage together. Thank you.
Back in safe harbor.
Yeah,
thanks,
back
Greg.
in safe
really,
harbor.
I appreciate it.
So, Randi, we just finished the podcast, and one of the producers here in the room asked another question. They wanted you to describe what's it like, the challenges, the opportunity, however you want to describe it, of being a woman in science. And you and I both said we were trying to get at that indirectly by example, but we want it straight out. So if you could just give it to us, because you're the authority.
What's it like to be a man in science? Has anybody ever asked you that question?
No.
Right. I would say that for the first time in history, it feels pretty easy, because the world is kind to women in terms of enabling telepresence. But also, I'm not the only woman on a ship anymore. I mean,
Right.
there are lots of expeditions when I started this where I would be the only woman in the room,
Right.
and it's not true anymore. There's a lot more gender equality out there, and so I think that there are times and places where it's still a real challenge. I've been on an expedition in Saudi Arabia as a Jewish woman, and that's a complicated one, but it works, right? There are times and places where it can still be a challenge, but even Saudi Arabia is changing, and it's easier and better now than it's ever been before. And so I'm hoping that more women will start asking the question, what's it like to be a man in science?
Easy.
It should be getting harder.
Yeah. That's a good, easy, but getting harder because of all these women that are now.
You don't think you're allowed to say that.